The ceasefire that wasn't. A 72-hour truce in the Gaza Strip that began on Friday fell apart almost immediately. It was supposed to coincide with Israeli-Palestinian negotiations in Cairo on finding a longer-term solution. So where do they go from here? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine Dennis. Another ceasefire and another failure. The truce in the Gaza Strip was supposed to last 3 days. It didn't last 3 hours. The Israeli government and Palestinian armed groups had planned to use this break to negotiate a longer-term solution. So whose fault was it? Hamas and Israel blamed each other, and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu repeated his promise to destroy the tunnel network in the territory. We'll look at the impasse in the Gaza crisis in just a moment, but first let's get this report now from Gerald Tan.
A truce in name, but tenuous in nature and perhaps now in tatters. The 3-day humanitarian ceasefire in the Gaza Strip had just come into effect. Both sides had agreed to a pause in hostilities under a UN and US brokered deal.
Israel will be able to continue its defensive operations for those tunnels that are behind its lines. And the Palestinians will be able to receive food, medicine, and additional humanitarian assistance, as well as to be able to tend to their wounded, bury their dead.
But just 2 hours in, Israeli tanks resumed their shelling. The military says its forces came under attack while decommissioning a tunnel, and an Israeli soldier was abducted. But Hamas says Israel breached the ceasefire when its soldiers advanced inside the Rafah borders. And a spokesman told Al Jazeera the group will not accept any continued Israeli operations.
This is not fair. See, we talked to the international mediators that if Israel continues its military operation on the ground, it is our right to defend ourselves and to take the necessary measures against them.
Where there is no fighting, there is devastation. This was the scene awaiting people who returned to the town of Jazeera in Khan Yunis.
We found our houses destroyed. We found nothing in our houses. What did we do wrong? Where will our children go? Where can we go? Our children can't go to school. There are no hospitals. We thought that the Arab world would stand with us. There is only God standing with us.
An Al Jazeera team arrived at Jazeera to find people retrieving decomposing bodies from homes.
It is a mass execution of 6 Palestinian youths who were brought to this bathroom. Look at the gunshots on the wall.
It's been 3 weeks since Israel unleashed its military on the Strip, and the number of casualties is rising, not by the day, but by the hour. Gerald Tan, Al Jazeera.
Well, for more on this, I'm joined by our guests. From London, Daniel Levy, Director of the Middle East and North Africa Programme at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Daniel was also an advisor to the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak. From Hebron, Mustafa Barghouti, Secretary General of the Palestinian National Initiative and a former Palestinian Information Minister. And also talking to us from London, Shashank Joshi, Senior Research Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. Thank you all for joining us here on Inside Story. But Shashank, can I start with you and ask the question why this conflict between Israel and Gaza has been allowed to get to this point when we're seeing a record number of casualties, a record number of fatalities, it must be said, and obviously this is the most protracted conflict of recent memory.
Yes, I think the first issue is that both sides have acquired objectives, military objectives and strategic objectives that they didn't possess at the beginning of the conflict. In other words, particularly on the Israeli side, this is a classic instance of mission creep. The tunnel issue exhibits this best. Tunnels and the destruction of Gaza's tunnel infrastructure was not a major military objective at the beginning of this conflict a few weeks ago, and now it's been elevated into the overriding principle of the campaign. And because of that, that's hindered efforts to achieve a ceasefire, and Israel last week rejected a ceasefire that was in some ways more generous than the one they accepted 2 weeks ago. That's a function of these new objectives. I think the second issue is also a complete failure of diplomacy. We've seen very, very slow US action, but also a real clashes between the people supposed to be mediating. We've seen this best in the absurd attempt to exclude Qatar and Turkey, of course, who are the countries that can actually talk to Hamas, and Egypt, which initially tried to produce a ceasefire proposal without even consulting Hamas. And so a complete sort of disjoint in diplomacy, and the tensions between Egypt, Qatar, Turkey and other countries is actually also hindering what should have been far more urgent diplomatic efforts at the beginning of this conflict rather than weeks into it, and once it had already escalated into a ground offensive.
And Daniel Levy, is this a vacuum then that the Israeli government is opportunistically exploiting?
Well, the Israeli government, of course, has become rather used to being able to act with impunity when it comes to the Palestinians. And that impunity, I think, sometimes does a disservice to Israel. This latest development, the apparent failure of a ceasefire, I think one can trace back to many things, but most immediately to the idea that Israel said, look, we'll take a ceasefire, but we have to be able to continue to operate against the tunnels during a ceasefire. That's not a ceasefire, I'm sorry. And so I think, Secretary Kerry was sent off with his marching orders, and he can't deliver that. Because if you're going to have a ceasefire, then that activity has to stop as well. I think it's very important to point out that in the statement, the formal statement issued, it actually says that during this time, the forces on the ground will remain in place. Secretary Kerry, speaking after the UN in India, then said that Israel will be able to continue its defensive operations. That wasn't in the formal statement. As soon as Israel asserted that ability to continue those operations, we saw the latest escalation. I'd draw a parallel to Israel just a few months ago when there were negotiations between President Abbas and Prime Minister Netanyahu's delegations. Israel said, sure, let's discuss two states, but the Palestinian state won't have sovereignty. It will have an Israeli military in it. We won't return and withdraw from the land. There won't be any Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem. Now go get me a two-state solution. That won't work either. What it means is that you actually have an Israeli side that ends up being foisted on its own petard, if you can accept that, because it's a victim of its success in that it has no exit strategy. And right now, the Israeli Prime Minister is finding himself, as Shashank suggested, being dragged deeper into this without an exit strategy because of that impunity. And the other point that is very important that was mentioned is this absence of mediation. And I think here Egypt really has to decide, is it a mediator or is it a party to this conflict? And is it seeking, just as internally it's seeking the destruction of the Brotherhood, is it seeking the destruction of Hamas via the Israeli military? If it is, it can't be a mediator.
And Mustafa Barghouti talking to us from Hebron. Is the Palestinian cause being undermined by the fact that the armed factions from Gaza, including, of course, Hamas, do not seem to be speaking with one voice? And we don't seem to have heard a great deal from the Palestinian Liberation Organization or the Palestinian Authority.
No, that's absolutely not correct. And it's, in a way, a repetition of the Israeli narrative, which kept claiming that Palestinians are divided. It's absolutely not true. We were unified. We had a unified position, and there was a unified delegation that was going to Cairo. And they were told not to come because Israel violated the ceasefire. And I totally agree with Daniel. This ceasefire was not equal. It was a ceasefire from one side. They were expecting Palestinians to abstain from defending themselves, while the Israeli army would continue what they call their tunnel operations and continue bombarding Palestinian areas. And when Palestinians defend themselves, the Israeli army gets crazy. In reality, this whole conflict and this whole situation is about one very basic, simple fact. It is Israel and those who are supporting Israel, like the United States, that are assuming that the Palestinians are not equal human beings. We're not entitled to normal living. We're not entitled to securities like Israelis are. We are not even entitled to defend ourselves when we are attacked. And we are not entitled to resist occupation when we are occupied. This is basically the problem. And the problem is that Israel, as also was said, is allowed to be impunitive to international law to the level that it is conducting massacres after massacres in Gaza. 1,570 people have died so far. Today alone, more than 100. And by the way, the killing is not taking place only in Gaza. It's taking place also in the West Bank. I am now in Hebron, where 60 people have just been injured with live ammunition just because they were peacefully demonstrating in solidarity with Gaza and demanding freedom. A young man was hit and killed in Tulkarem also this morning, and hundreds of others injured all over the West Bank. So basically, this what is not presented properly in the world media is that this is a struggle of people who are demanding freedom, who are demanding the end of occupation, who are demanding the end of a system of apartheid and discrimination that is eating our lives and our future. And in this conflict, we are not equal in a way, because the one side, the Israeli side, is the oppressor, the occupier, the one that is killing us and killing children. And Palestinians are defending themselves and trying to survive in very difficult conditions.
Okay,
I mean, one very interesting element here is that during this last war, if you can call it a war, just one moment, the Palestinian resistance did not kill civilian Israelis. They were killing Israeli soldiers inside Gaza, while the Israeli soldiers were killing civilian Palestinians.
Okay, let's pick up again, Shashank, with you, if I may. This idea of there being a lack of international engagement with the problem. What is happening in the Arab world so that we haven't seen a coherent voice coming from the Arab League, say, the Organization of Islamic Conference, in order to put pressure on Israel in order to stop its activities, and indeed upon Hamas and the other armed groups to stop their activities?
Well, there's 2 points to note here. First of all, the Arab world has been in a shambles for 3 years on a number of issues. The GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, is possibly at its most divided in decades, if not its entire institutional history. You've seen this over the past year or so with the incredible wrangling taking place between Qatar on the one hand and Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates on the other hand, who oppose Qatar's support for the Muslim Brotherhood and by extension, of course, Qatar's support in the form of political hosting, but also other financial support for Hamas. And so when you consider those divisions that have manifest themselves across the Arab world, across North Africa, from Libya to Egypt to other places, including Gaza, it's no surprise that the Arab League, that the Arab world, that the GCC is unable to speak with one voice. This goes back to Daniel's comment on what is Egypt's fundamental interest with relation to Hamas. Is it to destroy Hamas, destroy the Brotherhood in Egypt, or is it to end the fighting and secure better humanitarian conditions? The Arab world also has to decide that. I think the second problem is, let's assume for a second there was a concerted, unified, coherent Arab stance on this issue. Would it make a difference? Let's not kid ourselves here that the Arab world has enormous influence over Israeli actions. The basic problem here, of course, is that domestic political imperatives are far more important to Netanyahu and to Israel than outside imperatives. I take Daniel's point that international pressure has been minimal. That does make a difference. But ultimately, an overwhelming majority of Israel's Jewish majority supports Netanyahu's current approach to this. It supports the actions he's taken, does not view them as disproportionate, and his own cabinet, of course, is not only supporting his approach, but egging him on to further action in Gaza. And under those conditions, no amount of Saudi statements or Qatari initiatives to rebuilding Gaza or anything like that is really going to change the parameters in which Netanyahu and his cabinet members make their decisions.
And Daniel Levy, whilst the Arab world is dealing with its own problems, putting out its own fires, and perhaps the Americans more concerned about midterm elections, which are coming up quite soon, and you've already pointed out to the fact that Netanyahu doesn't necessarily have an exit strategy. It's been pointed out by former Foreign Minister of the UK, William Hague, that the window of opportunity for a two-state solution is closing. How far is it closing, or would you consider that it's actually slammed shut?
Well, I don't think that one can measure these things scientifically, Martine, but I think that what you have, and if one is going to zoom out and place this in the broader context, because of course I think the proximate issue is about getting an ending to this terrible killing and suffering, especially for the Palestinians in Gaza, and of course lifting the blockade. But if you zoom out, then one should also see this in the following context. Israeli policy is about entrenching and deepening the disconnect between Gaza and the West Bank. The Israeli Prime Minister came out fundamentally opposed and pushed in the international community to oppose the Palestinian reconciliation agreement, the attempt to reconnect the West Bank and Gaza, to rebuild the Palestinian polity. And I think that's part of his strategy of avoiding two states. We're very familiar with the demand placed on Hamas to recognize Israel and respect previous agreements. What people may be less familiar with is that the Israeli government has never recognized two states under Netanyahu. It's never taken that decision. His Likud party has never taken that decision. So I think what you are seeing here is an attempt to further atomize, if you like, the Palestinian issue by the Israeli government to a Gaza problem, a West Bank problem, let's say refugee problem, etc. What Mustafa Barghouti in Hebron, I think importantly pointed out to us is that you are seeing a very significant, perhaps not significant enough at this stage, but a very significant Palestinian pushback against that attempt to atomize, and probably an unintended byproduct of what Prime Minister Netanyahu has unleashed in Gaza is that the Palestinian unity effort, I think, has been strengthened. I wouldn't say it's fully robust, but I think it has been strengthened. I therefore would say that it's very unlikely, sadly, that we will come out of this conflict. Hopefully we'll get a ceasefire, but it's very unlikely that we'll come out of this with a more robust effort to actually get a process in place which doesn't just talk about peace, but actually addresses the occupation, the need for Palestinians to have their rights and freedom. And it's very important to say, Israelis will only really have their own freedom and security if indeed the Palestinians are no longer living under conditions of occupation and indignity.
And Marwan, then Mustafa Barghouti in Hebron. So the Palestinians emerge from this with more unity, in a stronger position, therefore. How distant a prospect, then, is the dream of an independent homeland without intervention from Israel?
I believe our freedom is closer than ever. And what you see today in the streets in the West Bank is a third intifada. Very similar to the first intifada in its nature. It's like popular, non-violent, mainly. And it is in solidarity with people of Gaza, of course. But this unity between Palestinians is born again on the ground. After 8 years of Israel trying to divide the West Bank and separate it from Gaza and from Jerusalem, the Palestinian people are reunifying again. And by the way, they are also reunifying their efforts with their brothers and sisters all over the world. Oslo stage is finished. Oslo was about limiting Palestinians to self-governing authority in what has become clusters of Pantostans in a system of racial discrimination. It's gone. It's over. It's a new stage. And anybody who doesn't realize that will just be making mistakes. Now, how close we are to our freedom, I think closer than ever, because there is a growing understanding of the Palestinian cause. There is a growing boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign against Israel that is very similar to what happened to the apartheid system in South Africa. What you see on the ground is Palestinians realizing they have to struggle for their freedom, and they will not get it through negotiations with Mr. Netanyahu. And on the other hand, will we get this freedom in one state or two states? I can't tell you, because it depends also on the Israeli side. But what we see today from this Israeli government, which is probably the most racist, the most extreme, and probably one day will be classified as the government that committed horrible war crimes against the civilian population in Gaza. What we see is a government that says they don't want one-state solution, they don't want two-state solution. So what do they want? A system of oppression and apartheid, ethnic cleansing, and massacres that are conducting periodically against Palestinians, a siege on Gaza that has created the worst humanitarian crisis ever. I hope and I do believe that the world will see the reality. This is not a fight between Israel and Hamas. This is not a fight between Israel and Gaza even. It's a struggle between people of Palestine who are demanding their freedom and a country that is oppressing them. And as Daniel said, the Israelis themselves will never get their freedom unless we are free. They are stuck into the system of apartheid. And I don't think any Jewish or Israeli person can be proud of the fact that Israel is conducting apartheid and oppression in the 21st century.
And Shashank...
Can I say something, Martine?
Yes, of course, please. Daniel, go ahead.
I just want to link something... Sure, thank you. I just want to link something that Shashank said and something that Mustafa said, which I think is very important. Shashank's correct that the Israeli public is behind this. It's not unusual in a time of war. Of course, there are rockets being sent over into Israel that the public would kind of rally behind. But I think the missing link here is that the Israeli public also feels that there is no cost or consequence to its denial of Palestinian rights and freedoms.
But it is suffering the greatest loss of life, a greater loss of life in this conflict than the last two combined.
It is, and that's of course significant, but I think what Mustafa said should not be lost on anyone, and that is the following: that probably the thing that will change the dynamics of this conflict is if the sympathy around the world for the Palestinian struggle for freedom, if that is translated into political asks of political leaders around the world that finally cause the Israeli public to wake up because they realize that they will not have impunity anymore. But the way I imagine that will happen is exactly what Mustafa has been advocating, which is, I would argue here, not putting words into Mustafa's mouth, not to break international law by targeting Israeli civilians. Of course, Palestinians have the right to self-defense, but to work within international law to pursue the kind of first intifada civil disobedience that Mustafa was talking about, to pursue the kinds of sanctioning that will wake Israel up, and international law itself. And I think that is what might change things finally.
And Shashank, so Daniel makes a very good point himself, and talking about the public sympathy, the waves of public sympathy that have been demonstrated around the world, whether that can be translated easily into political pressure. I mean, how likely is that? And I don't think we're talking about this in an immediate sense, are we?
Well, I'm far more sceptical than both Daniel and previously. I think, first of all, it's important to recognise international pressure is growing, concern is growing. The White House, for example, its statement condemning the shelling of a school was exceptionally strong. And I think even here in the UK, we're seeing senior politicians in the Tory party and elsewhere, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, use very strong language. But, and there is a but here, they are nonetheless very concerned about Hamas's actions within Gaza. That remains the case. At the time of speaking, it does appear that Hamas has broken ceasefire terms by capturing an Israeli soldier, ceasefire terms to which it agreed And while I completely agree with Daniel that the ceasefire was a very strange one, permitting Israeli actions and tunnel destruction, it remains the case that Hamas did agree to this. And in a few days' time, in a week's time, when Israel is able to proclaim it's completed the tunnel destruction mission, it can declare some kind of victory. If it is able to do that and declare a unilateral ceasefire, it will be back to the situation we were in 2 weeks ago, where Hamas were rejecting a return to the status quo and Israel were accepting one. And I think that'll put Hamas in a very difficult position. And so it's not going to end on terms that are as bad for Israel as I think may appear the case now.
Thank you to all my guests, Daniel Levy, Mustafa Barghouti and Shashank Joshi. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us on Inside Story. And thank you, of course, for watching. You can leave us your comments on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or you can go to @AJ Inside Story on Twitter. I'm Martine Dennis. Goodbye for now.